The phenomenon of political personality worship has been documented across centuries and continents, manifesting in monarchies, dictatorships, and even democratic systems. You would be easily forgiven if your immediate associations centered on the theatrical displays of North Korea's Kim dynasty or the omnipresent portraits of Mao Zedong during China's Cultural Revolution. But the systematic construction of leader veneration as a governing instrument, the deliberate transformation of political authority into quasi-religious devotion, reached perhaps its most sophisticated and extreme form in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin between 1929 and 1953. This was not spontaneous adoration. This was engineered consent, a meticulously orchestrated propaganda apparatus that presented Stalin as an infallible, almost divine figure whose wisdom, courage, and vision were portrayed as perfect. Every industrial achievement, every military victory, every scientific advancement was attributed directly to his genius. Every failure, every famine, every purge was blamed on saboteurs and enemies of the state. The mechanism Stalin employed created something far more unsettling than simple propaganda. They demonstrate how modern states can systematically dismantle the cognitive autonomy of entire populations, making criticism of the leader indistinguishable from treason itself, and converting millions of deaths into footnotes beneath the myth of the benevolent father of the nation. I'm your host, and today we are going to look at how Joseph Stalin constructed one of history's most powerful personality cults, the mechanisms he employed to maintain it, and why its influence persists decades after his death. To understand how Stalin constructed his cult of personality, we must first examine what he inherited. The Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 presented an ideological paradox that would haunt Soviet leadership for decades. Marxist-Leninist theory explicitly rejected the notion of individual greatness, emphasizing instead the historical forces of class struggle and collective action. Vladimir Lenin himself had critiqued personality cults in his theoretical writings, particularly in his 1902 work, What is to be Done, where he argued against the social revolutionaries' hero worship. Yet even during Lenin's lifetime, the seeds of contradictory practice were being planted. By 1919, Bolshevik propaganda increasingly featured Lenin as the embodiment of revolutionary consciousness. The assassination attempt on Lenin in August 1918 by Fanny Kaplan accelerated this process dramatically. As Lenin recovered, party organs began producing iconography that elevated him beyond mere political leadership into the realm of symbolic representation. The difference, however, remained crucial. Lenin's image served primarily as a stand-in for revolutionary legitimacy itself, not as an object of personal worship. When Lenin died on January 21, 1924, the leadership question became immediate and existential. The Soviet system had no constitutional mechanism for succession, no clear hierarchy beyond the informal power dynamics within the Politburo. Leon Trotsky commanded the Red Army and possessed revolutionary credentials that rivaled Lenin's own. Grigory Zinoviev controlled the Leningrad party apparatus. Nikolai Bukharin held ideological authority as the party's leading theorist. Joseph Stalin, by contrast, occupied the seemingly bureaucratic position of General Secretary, a post created in April 1922 that was initially viewed as administrative rather than political. This perception proved catastrophically mistaken. As General Secretary, Stalin controlled party appointments throughout the Soviet Union's vast territory. Between 1922 and 1928, he systematically placed loyalists in regional party positions, building a patronage network that extended into every corner of Soviet governance. By the time his rivals recognized the threat, Stalin had already constructed the institutional foundation for absolute power. The succession struggle from 1924 to 1929 followed a deliberate pattern. Stalin initially allied with Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to marginalize Trotsky, who was expelled from the party in November 1927 and exiled to Kazakhstan before being deported from the Soviet Union entirely in February 1929. Stalin then turned against his former allies, systematically dismantling their power bases between 1928 and 1929. Each victory expanded his control while simultaneously necessitating greater ideological justification. He needed not merely to defeat rivals, but to make their defeat appear historically inevitable, to position himself as Lenin's sole legitimate heir. Stalin's 50th birthday on December 21, 1929, marked the first systematic deployment of personality cult machinery. The celebration was unprecedented in Soviet history. Pravda dedicated its entire front page to Stalin, publishing congratulatory telegrams from party organizations across the Soviet Union. The Bolshoi Theater hosted a gala attended by the entire Politburo. More significantly, the Central Committee authorized the mass production of Stalin portraits for distribution to factories, collective farms, and government offices throughout the country. This timing was not coincidental. December 1929 fell precisely at the beginning of forced collectivization, arguably the most traumatic policy decision in Soviet history. Between 1929 and 1933, approximately 91% of Soviet peasant households were forcibly reorganized into collective farms. The policy triggered immediate resistance. Peasants slaughtered livestock rather than surrender them to collectives. Soviet cattle numbers dropped from 30.7 million in 1928 to 19.6 million by 1933. The regime responded with extraordinary violence. Historians estimate that between 1930 and 1933, approximately 1.8 million peasants were classified as kulaks and subjected to property confiscation, deportation, or execution. The resulting famine, particularly severe in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, killed between 5 and 7 million people by most scholarly estimates. Simultaneously, Stalin's public image was being carefully curated to distance him from these catastrophes. Party propaganda portrayed collectivization not as Stalinist policy, but as the logical fulfillment of Lenin's vision for socialist agriculture. When resistance occurred, it was attributed to kulak sabotage and bourgeois infiltration, never to systemic policy failure. The Soviet propaganda apparatus, reorganized under the Commissariat of Enlightenment, produced an increasingly sophisticated visual language. By 1931, Stalin's image had achieved standardization across multiple media. Paintings invariably depicted him in his characteristic military tunic, often gazing thoughtfully toward the horizon or consulting with workers and peasants. The message was carefully constructed: Stalin as the patient teacher, the wise guardian, the man who understood the people's needs better than they understood them themselves. Newspapers and magazines implemented rigid stylistic requirements. Stalin's name, when printed, had to be in bold type. Photographs required approval from party censors before publication. By 1933, a specialized department within the Central Committee oversaw all Stalin-related imagery, ensuring consistent messaging across the Soviet Union's 11 time zones. The cult was becoming institutionalized, embedded within the bureaucratic structures of the state itself. The first 5-year plan, despite catastrophic human costs, provided another propaganda opportunity. When the plan was declared complete in December 1932, 9 months ahead of schedule, and with wildly inflated statistics, Stalin received sole credit for Soviet industrialization. The construction of massive projects like the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Magnitogorsk steel complex became inseparable from Stalin's personal genius. Technical experts who had actually designed these facilities went unmentioned or were later arrested during the Great Purge. The assassination of Sergei Kirov on December 1, 1934, represented a pivotal moment, though its exact circumstances remain contested by historians. Kirov, the Leningrad party chief, was shot by Leonid Nikolaev inside the Smolny Institute. Whether Stalin orchestrated the murder, as some scholars argue, or merely exploited, it remains uncertain. What is undeniable is how Stalin utilized Kirov's death to justify an escalating campaign of political terror. Within hours of the assassination, Stalin personally traveled to Leningrad and assumed control of the investigation. The event triggered the Kirov Decree, formally titled, "On the Procedure for Cases of Terrorist Organizations and Terrorist Acts," which allowed for expedited trials without right of appeal. This decree would serve as the legal framework for the show trials that followed. The Moscow trials between 1936 and 1938 eliminated the remaining old Bolsheviks who had participated in the 1917 revolution. In August 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev were convicted of organizing a Trotskyite Zinovievite terrorist center and executed. In January 1937, Karl Radek and 16 others faced similar charges. In March 1938, Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and others were tried as the bloc of Rights and Trotskyites. The confessions extracted from these defendants were both spectacular and obviously coerced, featuring elaborate conspiracies involving foreign intelligence services and assassination plots. These trials served dual purposes within the cult of personality framework. First, they eliminated anyone who could credibly challenge Stalin's historical narrative or question his legitimacy as Lenin's successor. Second, and more insidiously, they demonstrated that even the most dedicated revolutionaries could be corrupted, creating a climate of universal suspicion where only Stalin himself stood above suspicion. If Zinoviev and Bukharin, who had worked alongside Lenin for decades, could be traitors, then anyone could be. The terror extended far beyond the political elite. Between August 1937 and November 1938, NKVD Order No. 0047 established quotas for arrests and executions in every region of the Soviet Union. Estimates suggest approximately 680,000 people were executed during this period, with roughly 1.5 million more sent to Gulag labor camps. The victims included not just party members, but ordinary citizens, ethnic minorities, religious believers, and anyone who could plausibly be categorized as an enemy. Simultaneously, Stalin's public image was reaching maximum glorification. The 1936 Constitution, often called the Stalin Constitution, was presented as the most democratic document in human history. Pravda declared it a gift from Stalin to the Soviet people. Schools required children to begin each day by thanking Stalin for their happy childhood. The short course on the history of the Communist Party, published in 1938 and officially attributed to a commission, but actually edited by Stalin himself, rewrote Soviet history to place Stalin at the center of every revolutionary achievement. Soviet cinema reinforced these narratives. The 1938 film, Lenin in October, depicted Stalin as Lenin's closest confidant and strategic genius. DESPITE, historical evidence showing their relationship was often contentious. The 1939 film, The Great Citizen, portrayed Stalin as the heroic defender against conspiracies, using Kirov's assassination as its narrative foundation. These films were mandatory viewing in factories, schools, and collective farms. The propaganda reached absurd proportions. Stalin was credited with victories in fields ranging from linguistics to agronomy to military strategy. The term Stalinist was applied to architectural styles, agricultural techniques, and scientific theories. Cities were renamed in his honor. Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad in 1925, though the cult reached its zenith long after. By 1939, the Soviet Union had become, in effect, a theocracy with Stalin as its deity, though one officially premised on atheistic materialism. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 23, 1939, presented an immediate propaganda challenge. For years, Soviet citizens had been taught that fascism represented capitalism's final, most dangerous form. Suddenly, Stalin's portrait appeared alongside Hitler's in Soviet newspapers. The propaganda apparatus pivoted seamlessly, emphasizing Stalin's strategic genius in securing Soviet borders and avoiding premature conflict. When Germany invaded on June 22, 1941, Stalin's initial response bordered on paralysis. For approximately 2 weeks, he largely withdrew from public view, leaving subordinates to manage the crisis. Soviet forces suffered catastrophic defeats. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht had advanced to Moscow's outskirts, and approximately 2.8 million Soviet soldiers had been captured. These early disasters resulted partly from Stalin's purge of the Red Army as officer corps between 1937 and 1938, when approximately 30,000 officers were arrested or executed, including 3 of 5 marshals and 13 of 15 army commanders. Yet Stalin's cult of personality proved remarkably adaptable. His July 3, 1941, radio address beginning with the unprecedented phrase, "Brothers and sisters," marked a rhetorical shift. Rather than invoking communist ideology, Stalin appealed to Russian nationalism and patriotic defense of the motherland. The Russian Orthodox Church, brutally suppressed since 1917, was partially rehabilitated to mobilize religious sentiment. Stalin's image transformed from revolutionary leader to national savior. Standing in the tradition of Alexander Nevsky and Peter the Great, military victories enabled renewed glorification. The Battle of Stalingrad, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, became inseparable from Stalin's name, despite questionable strategic decisions that had initially made Stalingrad vulnerable. When Soviet forces achieved victory, propaganda credited Stalin's military genius exclusively, minimizing the contributions of actual commanding generals like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. Stalin awarded himself the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union in March 1943, despite never having received formal military training. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, he promoted himself to generalissimo, a title last used by Alexander Suvorov in the 18th century. The cult narrative now positioned Stalin as the supreme military commander who had defeated fascism through personal strategic brilliance. The Tehran Conference in November 1943, Yalta Conference in February 1945, and Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945 provided opportunities for Stalin's image to expand internationally. Soviet propaganda depicted him as equal to Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, the triumvirate who had saved civilization. Photographs showing the 3 leaders together were distributed throughout the Soviet Union, visual proof of Stalin's stature on the world stage. By 1945, Stalin's cult had achieved complete societal penetration. The Soviet Union's territorial expansion into Eastern Europe created new populations subject to his glorification. Cities across newly acquired territories were renamed for Soviet leaders. Königsberg became Kaliningrad, for instance. Stalin's portrait appeared in homes throughout Eastern Europe, not always voluntarily, but always visibly. The immediate post-war years saw the cult reach its most extreme manifestations. Stalin's 70th birthday on December 21, 1949, generated celebrations that dwarfed his 50th. The festivities extended for an entire week. The Moscow Bolshoi Theater hosted a 4-hour gala featuring ballet, opera, and orchestral performances exclusively praising Stalin. Foreign communist parties sent delegations with elaborate gifts. Mao Zedong, having recently established the People's Republic of China, traveled to Moscow specifically for the celebration, his first trip outside China. Soviet scientists competed to credit Stalin with advances in their fields. Biologist Trofim Lysenko attributed his pseudoscientific theories about inherited characteristics to Stalin's insights, despite these theories contradicting established genetics. Linguists claimed Stalin had revolutionized their discipline through his 1950 essay, Marxism in Questions of Linguistics, despite the essay's limited scholarly contribution. The Soviet Academy of Sciences established the Stalin Prize, which became the highest honor in Soviet culture, exceeding even the Lenin Prize in prestige. The cult's intensity reflected Stalin's increasing paranoia and isolation. The Doctor's Plot of January 1953 represented a particularly ominous development. Stalin announced that a group of predominantly Jewish physicians had conspired to assassinate Soviet leaders through medical malpractice. The accusations echoed classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and appeared designed to justify another major purge. Historians generally agree that had Stalin lived longer, a terror campaign rivaling the 1937 to 1938 period would likely have followed. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, came suddenly. He suffered a stroke on March 1st, but received inadequate medical care, possibly because physicians feared the Doctor's Plot accusations. His death triggered immediate uncertainty among Soviet leadership. The personality cult had become so thoroughly institutionalized that the system itself seemed potentially unviable without its central figure. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress on February 25, 1956, officially denounced Stalin's cult of personality. Khrushchev detailed Stalin's crimes, his arbitrary rule, and the systematic terror he had inflicted. The speech circulated through party organizations, but was not officially published in the Soviet Union until 1989, during Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost reforms. Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum in 1961 and reburied beside the Kremlin wall. Yet the cult's legacy persisted in ways both obvious and subtle. Soviet leadership never fully repudiated Stalin's methods, only his excesses. The institutional structures he created, centralized party control, state security apparatus, ideological monopoly, remained fundamentally intact until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. His template for personality cult construction was exported throughout the communist world. Kim Il-sung in North Korea, Mao Zedong in China, Enver Hoxha in Albania, and Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania all adapted Stalin's techniques to their own contexts. Contemporary Russia has witnessed partial Stalin rehabilitation. Public opinion polls conducted by the Levada Center show that positive evaluations of Stalin have increased significantly since 2000. In 2019, approximately 70% of Russians viewed Stalin's historical role as either entirely or mostly positive. This rehabilitation reflects nostalgia for Soviet superpower status, emphasis on social order over individual rights, and state-sponsored narratives emphasizing Soviet victory in World War II while minimizing Stalin's crimes. The mechanisms Stalin employed reveal uncomfortable truths about human susceptibility to authoritarian messaging. The combination of controlled information environments, elimination of alternative power centers, systematic terror creating universal insecurity, and constant positive reinforcement of leader worship proved devastatingly effective. These techniques were not unique to communism. Fascist regimes employed similar methods, as have various authoritarian governments across the political spectrum. Stalin's cult of personality was ultimately about control of information, control of historical narrative, control of the boundary between permissible and forbidden thought. It demonstrated that given sufficient state power and willingness to employ violence, populations can be made to publicly celebrate even those who oppress them. The psychological damage extended across generations, creating populations habituated to viewing authority as unchallengeable and truth as determined by power rather than evidence. As we examine Stalin's cult in historical perspective, we confront questions that extend beyond Soviet history. How do societies prevent the concentration of power that enables personality cults? What institutional safeguards prove effective against authoritarian drift? How do populations recover from systematic psychological manipulation? These questions remain relevant because the fundamental dynamics Stalin exploited, human needs for security, belonging, and meaning persist across time and culture. Stalin's cult of personality represents more than historical curiosity. It stands as a warning about the fragility of rational discourse in the face of organized propaganda, about how quickly elaborate systems of lies can become normalized when alternative voices are silenced. The cult outlived Stalin himself, shaping Soviet society for decades and influencing global communism's trajectory. Its echoes continue reverberating through contemporary authoritarian systems worldwide. If you found this examination valuable, please consider supporting our continued exploration of Cold War history through likes, subscriptions, and notifications. History rarely presents us with simple narratives of heroes and villains. The Cold War era particularly demands nuanced analysis, recognition that ideological conflicts produced complex motivations and tragic consequences across all involved parties. Stalin's cult of personality, while extreme in its manifestations, emerged from specific historical circumstances and human vulnerabilities that transcend any single political system. Understanding these dynamics remains essential for recognizing similar patterns wherever they emerge, under whatever banner they march. Until next time.